90s were responsible for a great many things. Walkmans, Miami Vice, the young ones, shoulder pads, perms. Hey, I never said they were all great, but one of the biggest and most enduring was the action hero. Mortal Kombat was built on that very concept, covering a myriad of consoles and computers of the time, including the amazing Commodore Amiga and all its disc-swapping joys. But here I'm going to dive back into the early 90s and the origins of the arcade pop icon, what Ed Boon, John Tobias and co wanted to make, what inspired them, the movies, the muse, the gore and the controversy. This is a retro perspective of epic proportions. So what are you waiting for?
Get over here!
Nostalgia, it's one hell of a drug. And that Golden Harvest logo and gong always takes you back to that endorphin hit it gave. The anticipation of what was in store. Action, skill, excitement and violence. And violence is a constant force in the world, along with passion and inspiration. And as the saying goes, life imitates art, so has other mediums. The Western drove cinema into the mainstream, lasting from the 20s to the glorious spaghetti westerns of the 60s. The iconic hero with no name would ride into town, save the day with a cool, calm and calculating demeanour. Neither bad nor good. An anti-hero with skills, an unknown past and little fear.
You see, he got all riled up when you fired those shots at his feet.
You making some kind of joke?
No. You see, I understand you men were just playing around, but the mule, he just doesn't get it. Of course, if you were to all apologize...
Revenge often played a central theme, and even though they weren't good guys, they always had a reason for what they did. Rarely causing the trouble, but most certainly ending it. The short-lived but hugely popular genre gave way and heavily influenced the kung fu or martial arts wirework movies from the likes of Golden Harvest or the Shaw Brothers in the 60s. Martial arts tales would follow a similar path, with usually a final showdown at the end, mano v mano. Then in the early 70s, a bright star gave birth to modern martial arts, and he needs no introduction. Bruce Lee's impact then and now was immeasurable. For my brother and myself, he was the single largest reason for both of us taking up martial arts and millions of others across the globe. Skilled in both mind and body, Bruce studied other arts, boxing, judo, dancing even, and took inspiration from them all, unified and adapted them. Remember this point. His speed, charisma and accuracy are not something for today's video, but his choreography, fluid movement, emotive sound and motion from his screen presence incorporated mixed styles which all stemmed from his own Jeet Kune Do. Sadly, his light burned out very quickly, but in the short 3 years he was making motion pictures, he embodied and ultimately modernised that very same lone gunslinger role, whilst defining how we view great martial artists ever since. And fighting games are no different. Building on the 70s iconic trailblazing that Bruce Lee left behind, then the exploitation and cash-ins or copycats, some incredible, some less so. The 80s ushered in a changing of the guard, and out with the 60s and 70s action legends such as Bruce Lee, and a new generation of high-kicking heroines and heroes arrived, amongst them the muscles from Brussels himself, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Of course there were many more, but they all owed a debt to Bruce Lee and the impact he made on action cinema. But Ed Boon and John Tobias were mostly influenced by his American debut in the James Bond-esque Enter the Dragon. This adventure tale of a clandestine organised fight in Hong Kong, shrouded in secrecy and threat, was both intoxicating and exciting. Obvious influential areas lie within Liu Kang being the game's Bruce Lee, less obvious are the stages, with the monk temple being pulled directly from Enter the Dragon's opening, complete with clapping monks and movie-sampled sounds.
Sub-Zero wins.
Shang Tsung sits at the back, viewing just like Hans does during the contest in Hong Kong. Samples also come from the movie, which are also true for the Commodore 64 smash hit Way of the Exploding Fist. Test Your Might is pretty much boards do not hit back, and most of the game's 6 stages owe a large debt to scenes from the movie. And I think the fatality inspiration kind of explains itself.
Fatality. Liu Kang wins. Fatality.
The Jean-Claude influence stemmed from the influence and fully bullshit-driven fairy tale of Frank Dux and his secret kumite that did not, or maybe even did not, take place in Hong Kong during the early 80s. Nevertheless, bedtime tales of a Steven Seagal precursor or not, the 1988 Bloodsport movie put Van Damme on the mainstream map and into the hearts of martial arts action lovers. His incredible physique were only surpassed by his strength and mix of disciplined skills. Many years of formal ballet training merged with his longer years of Shotokan karate enabled his as then rare full box splits and high control and high kicking ability to stand out from the crowd. Make no mistake, Jean-Claude was a star in the making and his talent was not underappreciated at the time. So explosive was his impact during the late 80s and early 90s, he became a huge focus for the game's development. John Tobias, being a comic book fan and artist, had originally conceived the game to be ninja themed, based on the mythical Chinese ninja in the Lin Kuei, moving away from the popular Japanese ninja of the time, such as in films starring Sho Gasugi. It was Ed Boon that pushed on Van Damme, so much so he wanted to title the game that.
I'm Johnny Cage. No contest.
You like this kind of fighting, huh?
Yeah.
Luckily for us though, he refused the deal and thus Johnny Cage was born. Their initials and blatant backstory leave no doubt on just who he is based on, as did the Frank Dux tale, which is really just his dream of Enter the Dragon, but as an American. This is evident in Bloodsport, which mimics much of that movie. Other design cues specific to the film do show through. The dragons in the film are extensively used and part of the logo for Mortal Kombat itself. All the varied and bold archetypes of protagonists cover each with distinct styles and cues, and just like Bruce Lee, the team took inspiration and motivation from many avenues, which was something by extension the game excelled at: pop culture influences. In my opinion, this is the title that kicked off the focus group development approach that can affect games today. It almost ticks so many boxes of the time, it was unfathomable to think it would fail. Something they pioneered with, again having public tests on prototype boards to gauge interest, which itself is nothing new, but that feedback helped them narrow the target further. Their final character of the 7 sent them head over heels when she debuted. Literally. Sonya Blade is Cynthia Rothrock in all but Olivia Newton-John spandex leotard. Well, this was physical after all. From the blonde hair, high kicks and wheel flip being a play on Cynthia's famous hooking axe kick, the flexibility and power of Cynthia is mirrored in Sonya's moves. The 80s attire sealed the deal, but also tip off that the actress Elizabeth McKelly was a dancer and not a martial artist. The video capture sessions relay more on the move that gained as much attention as Chun-Li's spinning bird kick, which was clearly on their minds when capturing these digitization sessions. Once the animation and character was finished, mere months before its October 1992 release, the audience flipped out over Sonya Blade, named after Ed's sister. And the pop culture influences kept cropping up, from Terminator 2, which was setting the world alight during the game's development, and being the basis for Midway's earlier arcade, which had continued the studio's digitization of film models or actors into sprites. This had started from Narc in the 80s and improved through to T2 arcades, but Mortal Kombat was the most involved yet. The influence remained with Kano, with more than a passing reference to the T-800, complete with half-metal face and red eye. The 1995 movie goes even further on this cyborg-like design. The outfit was a simple cheap Phantom of the Opera mask the team bought, sprayed silver and stuck on the actor's face with that red eye addition. Due to the, relative to now at least, low quality digitized sprites, this was all very convincing. At the time though, the techniques were state of the art for games and delivered yet another enduring character in Kano, born from the current pop references. And the iconic characters kept coming. Raiden is an obvious influence of the 1983 Tsuhawk horror actioner Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain, with 2 of the 3 Peking opera brothers in Sammo Hung and Yun Biao starring. Both the mystical and mythical horror elements, bold primary defined colours and distinct character design show influence in the game, as do the special moves, with fireballs, magical daggers, sonic blasts which mirror the powers in the film. Many attribute the influence to the later 1986 cult hit in John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China, with the 3 storms, rain, thunder and lightning, or wear the wicker hat of the Ronin and aligned with Richard Edlund's lightning visual effects that stood out in the movie, or being hand painted onto cell overlays for each frame. But Big Trouble was inspired by Zoo Warriors just as John Tobias was with Mortal Kombat. He actually noted this himself in an interview many years ago. More so than Big Trouble in Little China, although I'm sure it did help bring the attention to this great movie and focus his inspiration, with the prolific Thunder God being almost a lift and shift character move into the game from the movie, complete with blue streaks of lightning and teleportation. Scorpion and Sub-Zero were both likely remnants of the original game idea that was rejected by Ed Boon, that ninja-themed title. But these 2 wore the ninja outfits of the mythical Chinese ninja rather than the Japanese one, keeping John's original design, and the same character was motion captured in the single outfit, but split moves were allocated to each, including the stances. But utilising a simple palette swap, an old school technique even then on 8 and 16-bit machines, to maximise memory by simply changing the palette of a sprite to virtually increase character variety. Here it worked very well with the contrast of blues and yellows combined with the sufficiently altered moveset, completed our roster of 7 characters. Well, It's like the 8th hidden reptile, which is yet another palette swap from Sub-Zero and Scorpion, but it managed to achieve a good roster of fighters, or one that compared favourably to the game's single biggest reason for existing.
Stay calm. Concentrate on the screen. Street Fighter II is on Super Nintendo. From the arcades, the ultimate combat game, Super Nintendo with Street Fighter II. It's unbeatable.
Throughout the years of film and game, violence has always been a core theme, as covered in Chapter 1. Video games did absolutely nothing to buck this trend, and as the arcade golden years started to draw in during the mid to late 80s, it seemed as if nothing was going to bring back that Space Invader, Pac-Man pole position-like explosion again. Capcom tried with the first Street Fighter, which was then known for its mixture of that strength test games you saw often at fairs to use to punch and kick in the game. It did okay here in the UK, but never really blew the doors off in 1987, with various ideas bandied around on the follow-up, one of which was Final Fight, as the original sequel to Street Fighter. It was actually 1991 when the fighting genre and arcades as a whole welcomed a renaissance, thanks to 8 fighters from across the world defined the 2-player arcade game, and the rest is history. Street Fighter 2 was the reason Mortal Kombat was made at all. It was no surprise that Midway were keen on pushing the spectacle of arcades, with their games often being very impressive, causing all to notice them when you're walking through the arcades. The visual presentation and sound were key reasons, and with Mortal Kombat, they knew they could take that style and ramp it up to 10. They came close to the same roster as Street Fighter 2. Sadly though, when Mortal Kombat hit the arcades, the Championship Edition and then the Turbo Editions had increased the roster by 4, with the Shadaloo bosses now playable. But Mortal Kombat was not going after the same market. Not directly anyway. By the early 90s, we had all moved on beyond teenage boy gets montaged to a master. No, we had reached full Kumite level, and anything less than a violent wave of vengeance or a fight to the death was not worth our time. Early hits mixed up the pop culture influence from games into films. Jackie Chan led on this with his Japanese manga comic City Hunter movie, pulled great inspiration from Japanese manga comics in The Young Dragon Gambler, and even delivering the best celluloid version of Capcom Street Fighter 2 with an incredible parody on Chun-Li, Honda and Gary Daniels' perfect Ken impersonation, with the hair to do him justice. Even Delsin was accurately portrayed and for comedic effect, with Wong Pei's colour style and direction merged with Charlie Chaplin's style of Jackie Chan. It all worked well. Even Bruce Lee got a hint in there as well. But the 90s was all about the edgy darkness, and this drove the direction of Mortal Kombat. This darker, grittier style around the time started to influence films, games and media. Unlike Street Fighter 2, which was based on the bright, vibrant manga comic books such as Dragon Ball of the 80s, Mortal Kombat was the polar opposite. The art style is gritty, dark and moody, and unlike the bright manga style of Street Fighter 2, the digitized character art dictated much of this, with limited colours and themes needed to work within the limited palettes the arcade board supported. But during development, the main focus was on the violence, and with the dizzy mechanic being factored into the end of battle, they devised the fatality, and this was the game's biggest draw by far. Seeing poor blood splats was not new. Neither was gore in games, and even digitization, as this had been a drive on the Commodore 64 in the 80s, with Jack the Ripper, Wolfman and other titles. The reason Mortal Kombat was so impactful was the quality of the characters and the fact it was the polar opposite to the comedic violence of Street Fighter. This also brought back an old adversary of the 80s us older peeps will recall. Censorship, Mary Whitehouse, and in the US even Congress and the Mothers Association. During the mid-80s, rock music was the spawn of Satan, with huge bands such as Black Sabbath, Wasp and Twisted Sister all being accused of violence, sexual content and satanic cult worship, hiding verses that summon demons when playing your record backwards. Again, all horseshit, but it forced the industry to censor itself, and the famous speech from Twisted Sister frontman Dee Snider left US Congress lost and scrambling as he blindsided them with his scruffy rock attire, for him to only deliver a well-constructed, logical argument and speech that they simply had no answer for.
The only person addressing this committee today who has been a direct target of accusations from the presumably responsible PMRC. I would like to use this occasion to speak on a more personal note and show just how unfair the whole concept of lyrical interpretation and judgment can be, and how many times this can amount to little more than character assassination.
Again, little has changed in all these years, with politicians still being undereducated and ill-prepared. The result was the music industry, much to Twisted Sister's disdain, added explicit lyric warnings and age levels on the records to inform parents of the content. And Mortal Kombat, along with Night Trap, found themselves in the middle of history repeating itself only a few years later.
One sequence in Night Trap in particular, in which a girl is stalked and seized by ghoulish figures, then put in a metal clamp around her neck and dragged off screaming, has provoked a hostile reaction.
In the UK, we already had the BBFC rating, which rated movies anyway, and we'd applied these to games since the 80s, but in America, this was still the world of just video games are for kids, and the ESRB was born. As such, Mortal Kombat was pulled into the courts again to discuss its horrific actions on the youth, corrupting their minds and showing them violence they had not seen since, well, TV, comics, movies, books, well, anyway, for decades, you get it. As the old saying goes though, there's no such thing as bad publicity, and if you want to gain more demand and notoriety, for your product at least, then making it taboo is possibly the very best thing you can do. And as such, Mortal Kombat was thrust into the public spotlight in the early 90s, specifically in 93 when it came to the home machines, with every big channel show doing a hit piece on how depraved this all was. But many of the UK ones were far more informed and detailed, such as the BBC Late Show.
Now, you've seen the billboards all over Britain. Vinnie Jones, Ice-T and other assorted hard nuts glowering out over the words Mortal Kombat. It took a while to realise that this wasn't another Schwarzenegger blockbuster, but the latest addition to Britain's fastest-growing entertainment industry, computer games. Based on a popular video arcade game, Mortal Kombat is a martial arts war at your fingertips, technically more sophisticated and graphically more violent than existing games. In fact, the billboards were part of one of the biggest promotional drives the computer games market has ever seen. With a UK turnover of £15 million in its first week in the shops, Mortal Kombat was second only to Jurassic Park in the entertainment industry's hit parade of big earners.
The game was equally as big as Street Fighter, with it being a clear split of Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter fandom. All the big UK shows having specials on the game, such as Bad Influence and Games Master, the Dexter Fletcher years.
3 million copies of the Mortal Kombat game hit the streets on Monday, hot on the heels of a £500,000 ad campaign. What's so special about it? Those game characters are real people digitised into the game to make your beat-em-up look even better. So, are they just acting the part? Forget it.
My name is Liu Kang. If you want to get to the top, you gotta get through me.
The reality was that beyond the Las Vegas lights and dazzle, the game was not as involved, skilled or fun as Street Fighter. The moves were all quite simple, the game cheated, which we all knew back then in the arcades, as it was clearly reading your inputs, something which affected so many games back then, such as Sega Mega Drive's exclusive Eternal Champions, but none of that mattered. What did was the visual impact, the gory fatalities and booming soundtrack all made up for the gaps in the arcades. At home, the biggest pull was the violence, and the child-friendly Nintendo took its final stance on keeping it clean for the kids, and arguably the best ports back then. But that impacted sales dramatically, and it gave Sega a huge lead in the older Mega Drive, which had all the gore intact, albeit with a cheat code.
Digitised characters literally rip the hearts out of each other's bodies and tear off each other's heads.
So here it is then, the first showing on British television of the game that everybody's talking about. This is Mortal Kombat. Now, the software company behind this are hoping that all the hype will sell some more copies of the game. But as a beat-em-up goes, it's no more violent than any other you can buy. The difference is that, like the coin-ops in the arcades that have a switch that turns off the violence, Mortal Kombat's got a gore code included. Now, a gore code is simply a cheat that lets you turn the violence on or off like a tap. this is it without the cheat. And this is it with it. I don't know what all the fuss is about myself. That cheat is only supposed to be available to anybody over the age of 18, but of course by now it's been published in all the magazines. Listen, take it from me, it doesn't add anything to the gameplay, and bear this in mind before you part with your hard-earned. In a month's time, the best beat-em-up ever comes to the Mega Drive. Good old Street Fighter 2.
The fact is, this was the only reason the game took off at the level it did. In reality, it was just another Street Fighter clone, a very accomplished and good one, but inferior overall in the gameplay stakes. Without the gore, it would have been quickly forgotten, and the Super Nintendo sales reinforced that, costing them the lead in console sales from the end of '93 right through to 1994 across the globe. But money talks, and in Mortal Kombat's case, Nintendo changed their tune and allowed the blood and giblets to fly when money and install base were at risk. Hey look, the kids will be fine after all. Hey Nintendo.
Scorpion wins.
This Monday, sweaty hands across the country will be able to grab hold of the most hyped game since Sonic 2. Mortal Kombat, claimed to be the most graphic beat-em-up ever.
Will Self, you're not a regular user of computer games. How did Mortal Kombat mess with your head?
Well, I don't think it messed with it at all, really. I mean, I think it's got very poor levels of what you call suspension of disbelief.
Now, with the game's title being a distinct hit, it was important they came up with the right one. As John Tobias was the Bruce Lee fan, with Ed Boon being in the Van Damme camp, the name was his desire, but with no Jean-Claude Van Damme on board, other names were branded around, from Kumite, Bloodsport, Deathblow, and other absolute belters.
Look? Death Kwon-Do? Bicep flex of death. Or there's the leg lifts of death. Or the pelvic thrust of death. That's one of my personal favorites. That one. That's the one I want.
Until the day Combat came with a capital K, and once this was decided upon by chance, a fellow Medway designer, Steve Ritchie, gave it the unmistakable 90s name, and in October 1992 the arcade world was finally invited to enter. And then a year later, it superseded the organised launch event that Sega had started in '92 with Sonic Tuesday. Mortal Monday was a phenomenal piece of marketing by Acclaim, and it is still, in my opinion, one of the most well-organised, designed and executed marketing campaigns ever, let alone in games. The result was a smash hit that secured the franchise's success in the echelons of the gaming almanac, and became one of the biggest console launches of all time. The original arcade was made on a $1 million budget, and by 1993 was the second biggest arcade in the US. In wider Europe and Japan, Street Fighter II was still number one, but Mortal Kombat was designed by Americans for Americans, and the sales results reflected that. But the game also marked a shift in the company's aims, with the home console and computers now being the growth areas, and by working with Acclaim, they fell into the common path of outsourcing the home ports for maximum impact and even higher revenue. On that fateful September 13th, 1993, aka Mortal Monday, the game landed on all big console formats across the globe. 16-bit in the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, which got the best versions and attention, but the handheld market was still huge and growing, with the dominant Game Boy and Game Gear getting their own ports, with some cutbacks, and then the 8-bit Master System got its own port of the Game Gear version in 1993, exclusive to Europe, and then the Mega CD saw a Mega Drive port in '94. Probe were a big porting house back then for Acclaim and handled many of these, with only the Super Nintendo version being organised by Nintendo directly to ensure a cleaned up iteration in their 16-bit classic, something which they later regretted. This was all handled by Sculptured Software. Finally, the then still popular Commodore Amiga saw Probe deliver a port alongside all other formats in '93, and in 1994 they ported this to the PC platform via DOS. It was clear that Mortal Kombat was here to stay, and every platform from computer to handheld was getting a piece of Mortal Kombat action.
Liu Kang wins.
And that's it for part 1. Join me in part 2 next week for my patron supporter program, or later if not, as I focus on what made the arcade such a monstrous hit with its specifications, how well these were ported to the myriad of 8 and 16-bit machines of the time, along with other copycats that did a varying degree of validating the quality of Midway's human executor. Remember, I am completely self-funded and independent, and if you enjoy my work here or over in IGN, then please help me by giving it a thumbs up. That really helps. Subscribe, comment, and even join my Patreon for early, extended, and exclusive access to content like this and others, along with the option to give me Q&A requests on my database videos. For now, though, I will draw this video to a close. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in part 2 or on the next one.
Now, how do you want to get out of here? The death jump or the death dump?
Ah, sick!